What's the hardest family conversation you've never had?
During my mom's birthday dinner, she looked straight at my sister and said, "Thank you for making me proud." Then she lifted her wine glass, smiled at Rachel, and didn't even glance my way. I started collecting the empty glasses before dessert came out. Someone has to clean up, right? You ever have a moment where everything around you slows down, not in a cinematic, dramatic way, but in a quiet, nauseating freeze that makes the skin on your face feel too tight and the air suddenly too thick? That's exactly what happened to me the moment my mother, Carol and Whitmore, turned toward my younger sister with that polished smile of hers, the one she saves for guests and waiters, and said it loud enough for everyone to hear, "Thank you for making me proud." Not a general, I'm proud of both my girls, not even a half-hearted nod in my direction. No, it was for Rachel. Just Rachel. The funny part is, it wasn't even surprising. Not really. That's the part that stung the most, I think. The predictability of it all. We were sitting in her backyard in Savannah, Georgia, under those damned string lights she insists make everything feel like a Nancy Meyers movie. Rachel and her husband Greg had flown in from Charlotte with their designer luggage and expensive cologne, carrying a carefully curated air of success that made my mother beam like a pageant judge watching her star contestant. I, on the other hand, drove in from Augusta after working a 10-hour shift at the clinic, still smelling faintly like antiseptic and stale vending machine coffee, wearing the same pair of flats I've had since Obama's second term. There were 11 of us around that table, Mom's two best friends, their husbands, Rachel's in-laws, my Aunt Lynn, and Uncle Dave, who was already 3 glasses deep into the bottle of Merlot and murmuring to himself about traffic. The food had been catered from a new Italian place she liked, the one with the impossible parking lot and truffle oil on everything. No one said anything when I offered to bring dessert. My mother had already decided Rachel would handle the sweets. She brought macarons. From Charlotte. Because apparently we don't have any decent bakeries in Georgia. Rachel had just finished telling some story about closing a multi-million-dollar property on Lake Norman when my mom clinked her glass. Everyone quieted down immediately, years of knowing that when Carol wants attention, she gets it. She stood up, smiled that trained smile, and said, "I just want to take a moment to say how grateful I am to be surrounded by so many people I love tonight. But especially, I want to thank Rachel for making me proud. All you've accomplished. You're the reason I can sleep easy at night." She raised her glass. Everyone followed. Rachel blushed like a debutante. And I sat there, chewing the inside of my cheek so hard it almost bled, smiling like someone who hadn't just been slapped in the face with a linen napkin. No one said my name. No one looked in my direction. Not even my aunt, who usually at least gives me a half smile when the Carol show kicks into full gear. I laughed, quietly, mostly to myself. Then I started picking up the empty glasses, hers first, Rachel's second, moving like a well-trained waitress who knows when the party's over and her presence is just taking up space. A couple of people mumbled, "Oh, you don't have to," but I was already in motion, already collecting dishes, already walking away from the sound of laughter and low conversation and Rachel's careful retelling of some vacation story from Cabo. Inside the kitchen, I stacked plates and rinsed utensils, letting the hot water steam the sting out of my eyes. I didn't cry. That's not something I do anymore. Not over this. Not over her. There's a certain kind of heartbreak that becomes so familiar, you stop treating it like an injury and start treating it like a houseguest who won't leave, you just move around it. I wiped down the counter, put the champagne back in the fridge, and left before dessert. No one noticed. Or if they did, they didn't stop me. I drove home in silence. No music. Just the soft hum of the road and the echo of my mother's words rolling around my head like marbles in a jar. "Thank you for making me proud." I had flashbacks to all the science fairs, piano recitals, and straight-A report cards that earned me nothing more than a pat on the head and a reminder to help Rachel with her homework. The same Rachel who cried through pre-algebra and dropped out of college sophomore year to find herself in Thailand, only to return 6 months later with a nose ring and a fiancé she met in an airport bar. Back then, I told myself it was just a phase, that eventually, Someone would notice how much I did, how hard I worked, how quietly I kept this whole family from falling apart every time Rachel threw another emotional grenade into the room. But now, at 38 years old, watching my sister be toasted and fawned over while I scraped cake crumbs off ceramic, I realized something ugly and painful and permanent. She wasn't ever going to notice. She didn't want to. The next morning, I woke up at 7:30, made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table scrolling through work emails. My back hurt. My head ached. And my phone buzzed. Rachel. She never texts me unless it's about mom's prescriptions or something she forgot to ask during our weekly family group chat. This time, it was just one sentence. She's been crying since you left. Did something happen? I stared at that message for a full minute, thumb hovering over the screen. The audacity of that text was almost impressive. Because something did happen. But she already knew that. She always has. The question is, what exactly is she crying about? Because I think we both know it isn't me. And that's when I felt it. That slow, low fire in my gut. Not rage. Not sadness. Something sharper. I wasn't going to cry. I was going to remember. And then I was going to do something about it. The message sat on my screen like a loaded gun no one had the guts to pick up. She's been crying since you left. Did something happen? A question that had no business being asked by someone who sat 3 feet away from me the night before, heard every word, saw every glance, watched every moment unfold in real time, and still chose to play the part of a confused spectator. As if she hadn't spent her entire life enjoying the view from a pedestal that someone else, usually me, was always quietly holding steady from below. I didn't respond right away, because the truth is, I wasn't sure what to say without lighting a match I wasn't ready to watch burn through every fragile thread holding this family together. It's a strange thing, waking up the morning after a humiliation that wasn't loud or obvious, but rather so quiet, so ordinary in its cruelty, that trying to explain it to someone else makes you sound like the crazy one. The sky outside my window was a dull blue-gray, the kind of sky that makes everything feel like it's waiting for something, a storm, an apology, maybe even a collapse. I stared at Rachel's text for a long time, letting the silence of my small apartment wrap around me like a wet towel, heavy and clinging. Eventually, I typed a single word, really. I didn't add a period. I didn't need to. Within 30 seconds, her typing bubbles appeared, vanished, reappeared again, and then finally settled into another message that made something inside me twist. She said she didn't mean to hurt you. She thought you were just being quiet like always. She's really upset. I think maybe you should call her. Of course. Of course she thinks I should be the one to fix it. That's the role I've always played, the buffer, the bridge, the mediator who makes everything easier by never asking for anything at all. I could practically hear her voice, syrupy with concern but laced with something condescending underneath it, like I was a child who didn't understand how grown-ups communicate. And maybe I didn't, not in the way she did, at least. Rachel knew how to say all the right things at exactly the right time, how to cry just enough to be believable, how to tilt her head and lower her voice and make people feel protective of her even when she was the one holding the knife. I stood up, poured myself a second cup of coffee, and leaned against the counter while my cat, Darwin, weaved between my ankles like he could sense something was shifting. I thought back to the summer I turned 16, the first time I realized that in our family, love was conditional, not in the cruel, overt way you read about in novels, but in the quiet, creeping kind of way where certain achievements, certain appearances, certain choices earned affection while others were met with silence or subtle disapproval dressed up as concern. That was the year Rachel broke her wrist falling off a horse during one of her riding lessons, and my mother spent 3 days straight at her bedside, spoon-feeding her ice cream and brushing her hair while I sat in the next room with a migraine so bad I could barely see straight, quietly waiting for someone to notice I hadn't eaten all day. They never did. People think favoritism is something children exaggerate, something they'll grow out of when they're older and can see things more objectively. But what they don't understand is that children are often the most accurate observers of human behavior, because they haven't yet learned how to lie to themselves about what they see. And what I saw, what I've always seen, is a mother who didn't just prefer my sister, but needed her to be the shining star so she could pretend our family was something it wasn't. I knew I couldn't talk to Rachel about any of this. She'd either get defensive, insisting I was reading too much into things, or she'd get teary and turn it into another performance about how hard it is being the favorite, as if being smothered in praise and leniency were somehow a burden. So instead, I decided to call someone else, someone who had seen this dynamic from the outside, but close enough to understand. Uncle Dave. Now, Dave wasn't actually my uncle by blood. He'd been my dad's best friend since high school, the kind of man who wore the same flannel shirt until the elbows gave out, who always smelled faintly like pipe tobacco and motor oil, and who had a way of telling the truth without sounding cruel. After my father died, Dave stayed close to us, sometimes stopping by with a bucket of fried chicken or a six-pack of beer and sitting on the porch with my mother like they were both pretending not to miss him. He never married, never had kids of his own, but he always treated Rachel and me like we were his nieces, though, looking back, I think even then he saw the difference in how we were treated. I texted him, "Are you home? I want to ask you something." He responded 5 minutes later with an address and 2 words, "Always am." When I got there, he was sitting on his porch swing, nursing a warm cup of coffee and watching the street like it might tell him a secret. He didn't say anything right away, just patted the seat beside him, and I sat down with a sigh that felt heavier than I meant it to. We sat in silence for a minute, then he said, "Something happened last night." It wasn't a question. I told him everything, not in a dramatic, self-pitying way, but just the facts, laid out like cards on a table. I expected him to nod, maybe murmur something noncommittal. What I didn't expect was the way his face changed when I got to the part about the toast. He went very still, very quiet, and then he said, "You know, your mama wasn't always like that." I turned to look at him, surprised. "She used to be softer," he said, staring out at the road. "Back before Rachel came along. Back when it was just you and your dad and her. She was different." I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't remember a version of my mother that was soft, or warm, or anything other than coldly efficient and image-conscious. But Dave seemed sure. And then he added something that hit me harder than I expected. "Your dad told me something before he passed. Something he never said out loud to your mama." I held my breath. "He always worried that she resented you." I blinked. "What? Why?" Dave shrugged, took a long sip of coffee, and said, "Because you reminded her of herself. The hard parts. The parts she didn't want to deal with." I didn't speak for a long time after that. Eventually, he looked at me and said, "You ever wonder why Rachel could get away with anything and still be called the angel?" I nodded. "Well, maybe it's time someone reminded your mama that not all halos are real." And, just like that, the fire inside me, banked and quiet for so long, flickered to life again. Not angry, not bitter, but focused. Because maybe this time, I wasn't just going to swallow it. Maybe this time, I was going to serve the truth the same way Rachel served her macarons, sweet on the outside, but hiding something sharp inside. There comes a point, after years of being cast in the same silent role, when something inside you begins to fracture, not in a dramatic, visible way that screams for attention, but slowly, in small imperceptible ways that start to change how you look at the people closest to you, as if a curtain you didn't even know existed suddenly drops, revealing a stage full of actors you thought were family. I drove home from Uncle Dave's house that afternoon feeling as though a fog had lifted, but not in the way that brings clarity or peace. Instead, it felt more like the unsettling moment right before a storm rolls in. When the sky changes color and the wind shifts and you know, deep in your bones, that something is about to give. What Dave had said kept looping in my mind, over and over, like a thread I couldn't stop pulling, that my mother resented me because I reminded her of the parts of herself she had tried to erase. At first, I'd wanted to dismiss it, chalk it up to an old man's observation tinged with sentimentality, but the more I let it sit, the more it felt accurate. Uncomfortably accurate. I started thinking back to all those moments, dozens, maybe hundreds, When my mother's praise for Rachel came loud and easy, while her words for me, if they came at all, were measured, careful, wrapped in practicality and often lined with implication. You're responsible. You don't need the attention. You're the strong one. And over time, I had worn those descriptions like armor, until one day I forgot there was anything soft underneath. But now I found myself wondering if I had been the one who needed saving, if I had been the one who stumbled or failed or cried in the middle of the night, would anyone have come running? It was with this burning question in my chest that I began doing something I had never done before. I started looking into Rachel. Not in a malicious way, at least not at first, but with a quiet curiosity that surprised even me, as if I had finally accepted that maybe, just maybe, the golden child in the spotlight had something to hide in the shadows. It wasn't hard, really not in today's world, where everyone's life is a curated performance for strangers and followers and algorithm-fed praise. I started with her social media, smiling photos of her and Greg at charity galas, champagne flutes held just so, coordinated outfits, captioned with inspirational quotes about gratitude and hard work and being blessed beyond measure. But it was all too perfect, too staged, too polished, and I've learned that real people, especially the ones who claim to have it all together, usually don't feel the need to prove it every 24 hours to an audience. Then I did something I hadn't done since high school. I opened LinkedIn. Her profile was as glossy as expected. Luxury property specialist, awards and certificates, client testimonials full of buzzwords and empty compliments. But what stood out wasn't what was there, it was what wasn't. Her company listed a team of agents, and while Rachel's profile was front and center, the actual recent sales credited to her name were conspicuously light. Curious, I clicked deeper, tracing property listings she'd posted to actual sales records online, and what I started to see made my stomach flip. Several of the properties she'd been showcasing as her personal closings had actually been handled by other agents on her team. Her name wasn't on the sale records, not as lead agent, not even in support. I dug further and found 2 properties she had posted as sold above asking thanks to my negotiating skills that had actually closed for less than the original list price. Which wouldn't be a big deal, people fudge facts all the time, except that Rachel had built her entire professional persona on being the top performer, the closer, the one who never leaves money on the table. The deeper I went, the more the cracks began to show. And then came the part one hadn't expected. One of the listings, a multi-million-dollar property in South Charlotte, was listed under her name, but the sale paperwork showed Greg as the buyer's agent. At first, I thought nothing of it. Married couple, both in real estate, it made sense. But when I looked at the purchase date and compared it to Rachel's timeline of travel, something didn't add up. She'd posted from Charleston that entire week, tagging beach photos and wine tastings with her friends. She wasn't even in the state. I didn't want to go further, but I did. I searched Greg's name next, and what I found took my breath away. There were photos, public, not hidden, on a local event photographer's website from a fundraiser in Asheville, 2 months ago. Greg was there, not with Rachel, but with another woman, tall, blonde, wearing a familiar necklace I'd seen Rachel post about months ago. The photo wasn't scandalous, but it wasn't innocent either. His hand on the small of her back, her head tilted toward him, both smiling in that way people do when they think no one else is watching. And then the final blow. I checked the woman's Instagram. Rachel followed her. They'd been tagged together. Friends. Or something else. I leaned back in my chair, heart racing, hands cold, not because I'd found proof that Rachel's perfect life was far from it, but because I realized something far more unsettling. She knew. She had to. There was no way Rachel, who noticed everything, who curated every inch of her life with obsessive precision, hadn't seen the signs. Which meant she was either choosing to ignore it or she was choosing to lie. And both options made her vulnerable in a way I had never seen before. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel superior. I felt stunned. As if I'd been handed a box I didn't know I wanted to open, only to find that it held more than just answers, it held power. For the first time, I held something Rachel didn't know I knew. And with that knowledge came an ache in my chest, a buzzing in my head, and a thought I didn't want to admit out loud, maybe I didn't just want to understand her. Maybe I wanted her to fall. Not out of hatred. Not out of cruelty. But because I had spent 38 years watching her shine at my expense. And now, for once, the spotlight was pointed somewhere else. And it was flickering. There are moments in life when the lines between memory and strategy blur so completely that even you, the one orchestrating it all, can't quite tell whether you're acting out of pain, truth, or something darker, more deliberate. Something that lives in the spaces between disappointment and revenge. Something that wears the face of justice, but speaks with the voice of a wound too old and too deep to ever truly close. It was in this strange, charged headspace that I found myself 3 days after that dinner, sitting at my dining room table with a plain, white box in front of me, a lid slightly askew, and a stack of letters I hadn't touched in years. Letters written in my father's scrawled handwriting, some barely legible, most of them never opened by the person they were meant for. The letters were found accidentally, almost a decade ago, during one of my mother's impulsive attic purges when she'd asked me to help carry out a few boxes marked Old Office. They were stuffed inside a torn manila envelope wedged between outdated insurance forms and crumbling receipt books, and when I asked her what they were, she'd barely glanced at them before waving her hand and muttering, "Just toss them. Your father kept everything." But I didn't toss them. Something stopped me, some instinct I didn't fully understand then, and I slipped the envelope into my bag without saying a word. At the time, I didn't read them. I wasn't ready. I was still fresh from college, still too invested in preserving whatever image I had left of a family that, while never warm, had at least been functional. But now, after the toast, after the text, after the unraveling of Rachel's perfect mask, I found myself needing answers, or, at the very least, something real to hold on to. I opened the envelope and pulled out the stack. There were 9 letters, all of them addressed to my mother. None of them, from what I could tell, had ever been sent. What struck me first wasn't the content, it was the tone. These weren't love letters, not in the way you'd expect, not poetic or flowery. They were raw, hesitant, written in the voice of a man trying to understand the distance growing inside his home, the chill between the walls, the way affection had started to feel more like a negotiation than a given. In one letter, dated a few weeks before he passed, he wrote, "Carol, I know you love Rachel in a way that makes sense to you, and I don't question a mother's bond. But sometimes I wonder if you see Emily at all. She doesn't ask for much, but she shouldn't have to ask at all." Another one, written the year Rachel got her driver's license, said, "You speak of pride like it's a currency we get to hand out in limited quantities. But Emily's been steady, present, thoughtful in ways that go unnoticed. Just because she doesn't make noise doesn't mean she doesn't need to be heard." I sat with those words, letting them settle over me like dust, remembering how quiet my father had always been, how he never challenged my mother openly but instead chose small, subtle acts. Helping me with homework when she was busy fussing over Rachel's boy drama, bringing me peanut butter toast when I stayed up late studying, calling me his quiet storm with a little smile that told me he saw more than he let on. And so, the plan began to take shape, not out of bitterness, not out of some burning desire to humiliate, but out of something colder, cleaner, a need to hold up a mirror that no one could look away from. I decided to give my mother a gift. A proper one. I bought a simple white box from the stationery store near my apartment, wrapped it in neutral paper, tied it with a ribbon that looked elegant but not festive. Inside, I placed the letters, carefully ordered, each in a plastic sleeve to preserve them, not for sentimentality, but for effect. On top of the stack, I placed a photograph, one she hadn't seen in years, a candid shot from the summer of '97, taken by Uncle Dave, showing me and my father sitting on the edge of the dock behind our old house, our feet dangling above the water, my head resting against his shoulder while he looked out over the lake with a distant, thoughtful expression. It was the only photo I had where he wasn't smiling, and somehow, that felt more honest than any posed family portrait we'd ever taken. On the morning of our follow-up brunch, my mother's casual recovery gathering to make up for the awkwardness of the birthday dinner, I arrived early, as always, because she trusted me to help prep. Rachel was already there, of course, wearing soft blue linen and just enough makeup to look effortlessly radiant. My mother greeted me with a strained smile, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes, and made a comment about how she hoped we could all be grown-ups today. I nodded, handed her the box, and said, "Just something I found. Thought you might like to have it." She looked puzzled but intrigued. She placed the box on the dining table, but didn't open it right away. The brunch itself was uneventful, full of forced laughter and polite bites of quiche, the kind of meal that makes you feel lonelier than if you'd eaten alone. But I kept glancing at the box, and I saw the moment curiosity got the better of her. She opened it in front of everyone, assuming it was something charming or sentimental. At first, she said nothing, just lifted the photo, then the first letter. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, tightening at the jaw, a twitch near the eye. She read silently, the room oblivious, Rachel chatting with someone about her new office remodel. I saw my mother pause, look up, then back down, flipping to the next page, her lips pressing into a thinner and thinner line. I didn't say a word. By the third letter, she excused herself. By the time dessert was served, she hadn't returned. Rachel noticed eventually, of course. She asked where Mom had gone, and I simply said she needed a moment. That night, Rachel texted again. "She's not answering my calls. What was in the box?" I didn't reply. Some truths don't need to be explained. Some truths just need to be seen. And some mirrors, once held up, can't ever be put down again. The silence that followed the brunch didn't just linger in the days that came after, it expanded, filled spaces where conversation used to go. Coated everything like a fine layer of ash after a fire that had burned longer than anyone was willing to admit was ever lit. I didn't expect gratitude or confrontation or even acknowledgement because a part of me already understood, deep in the marrow of my bones, that people like my mother don't respond to revelations with self-reflection, they respond with retreat. With tightly controlled narratives and selective memory, with disappearing acts dressed up as grace. But still, I had underestimated just how thoroughly that box of letters, those truths spoken too late, buried too long, would fracture whatever fragile story she had been clinging to all these years. It was 2 days later when Rachel finally broke the silence. Her message came in at 10:15 in the evening, a time that told me she had been sitting with her thoughts longer than she was used to, that she'd paced through her immaculate home more times than she could admit before reaching the point of needing something from me. The text was simple, but not casual. Nothing Rachel did in times of uncertainty was ever truly casual. She wrote, "She's still crying. Since you left. She hasn't eaten. She won't speak. Emily, what the hell did you give her?" I stared at the screen for a long time, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly what I could say and understood, with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, that no version of the truth would land the way it should. Because Rachel didn't want answers, she wanted control back. She wanted the version of Mom that flattered her over brunch and took photos for social media and passed the gravy with a perfect manicure and a hint of passive praise. She didn't want the woman who had just been handed a mirror polished with guilt, regret, and the words of a man who had loved her but had seen through her even in silence. And as I sat in the dim light of my kitchen, the only sound the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old wall clock I'd inherited when my father died, I realized something else, something I hadn't been ready to admit before. What I had done wasn't about justice or setting the record straight. It was about forcing my mother to see what she'd spent years ignoring, about handing her a reflection she couldn't polish or smile away, about pulling the curtain off the role she had assigned me and refusing to play it anymore. For decades, I had stood quietly in the wings, absorbing every slight, every omission, every glance that never found me. I had smiled through birthdays where I bought the cake and wasn't offered a slice until last. I had celebrated Rachel's every milestone, even when I knew they came with compromises she refused to admit, and I had swallowed the bitter taste of being the daughter who was easy to overlook, not because I was forgettable, but because my pain didn't fit the story she wanted to tell about herself. I didn't reply to Rachel that night. Instead, I reread the last letter from my father, the one I hadn't put in the box, the one I'd kept for myself not out of selfishness, but because it didn't belong to anyone else. In it, he wrote, "If you're reading this, it means I didn't find the courage to say it out loud. But I need you to know that I saw you. All of you. The quiet strength. The steadiness. The way you show up even when no one asks. That matters. It always did. Don't let her make you feel invisible." He signed it with his full name, not Dad, not Love, Richard, just his name, as if he were documenting something official, something that needed to be remembered by someone who might otherwise forget that they were seen, that they were known. The next morning, I received another message from Rachel. Longer this time. Carefully worded. She said, I read the letters. She gave them to me. I don't know what to say. I didn't know he felt that way. She hasn't spoken much, but she keeps repeating your name like she's trying to figure out what it means now. She asked if you hated her. I told her you didn't. But I'm not sure if I was right. I could have written back and said, no, I don't hate her. I could have softened the edges, made it easier for both of them to sleep at night. But the truth was heavier, less poetic, not suited for texts or polite conversation. Because hate was never what I felt, not even close. What I felt was a kind of mourning, not for her, but for the version of myself I had built around her indifference. A version shaped by years of being passed over, of shrinking to fit the space she left for me, of bending toward silence, because that's what kept the peace. What I felt was the ache of loss for a relationship that never had a chance to grow because it was rooted in comparison and clipped before it could bloom. I didn't answer Rachel. I didn't go visit my mother. I didn't send flowers or leave voicemails or write long, therapeutic messages about healing or closure. Because I knew that in their world, healing wasn't about truth, it was about keeping things neat, moving forward without accountability, dressing the wound in silk and hoping no one notices the scar. And I was done with that. But still, part of me wondered, what would she do with those letters now? Would she burn them? Bury them? Frame them like artifacts from a life she no longer recognized? Would she use them as proof of her pain or hide them as evidence of failure? And more than anything, I wondered if, late at night, when the house was quiet and no one was watching, she would finally ask herself the question I had asked for years: why was I never enough? And maybe she'd come to understand, slowly, painfully, that the answer had never really been about me. Maybe she'd see that I wasn't the reflection she hated, but the one she feared. And in the end, that might be the most honest gift I ever gave her. Not forgiveness. Not vengeance. But the truth. Unavoidable. Unforgiving. Unsentimental. Something she couldn't put back in the box. Something she couldn't unsee. Something she might cry over, not just since I left, but for the rest of her life.